All right, complex numbers, okay, consists of, we have x squared, our variable squared, equals -1, and when we solve, when you take the square root, you get plus and negative square root of -1. This right here, where you have a negative inside the radical, or inside the square root, is no longer a real number. It is not a real number. All right, so that's what happens to have a complex number. In other words, you have a negative inside a square root. Now, and the reason why is no real number. So in other words, any number, any real number, cannot be squared to equal a negative number. All right, so for example, what that means is this. Give me a number. Let's say 3. If I square it, means 3 times 3, which is 9. All right, let's say -3, and I want to square it because it has to be squared. So that tells me it's -3 times -3, which is a positive 9. You notice, anytime I square a number, it becomes positive. So this up here says was intention. What is intentionally saying? Excuse me, I can't talk. All right. So what this is saying is that there's two numbers that are exactly the same. So when I multiply them together, I get a -1, and you can't. When you multiply a number by itself, it will always be positive. So that means it's not a real number. All right. Now in mathematics, in real life, you will have negative inside square roots. You know what it will happen. All right. So they created a new branch of math, and it's called, we have square roots with negative numbers in them. And what they do is they call it an imaginary unit. In other words, I, which is equal to the square root of -1. Remember, I is not a real number. All right, it's an imaginary number. It's just the way we use it to help work with numbers that are not negatives. All right, we're going to do examples, and that way I'll show you how I is helpful in this. All right. All right, the objective of this section is students will be able to determine the best method to solve a quadratic equation on variable, what? I have no idea what we're trying to say here. The students will be able to determine the best method to solve a quadratic equation given a variable and be able to solve by finding square roots. All right. I might have to go back and double check because I have no idea what that is saying in there. Interesting. Oh well, you'll catch on to it as we do these. All right, so let's solve. We're going to solve this right now. We're just going to be We're going to be solving by finding square roots. That's what we're going to be doing. Here's a quadratic because you got x squared, but that's the only thing in here. So this right here. And there's no other variables, so that means I'm going to solve by finding square roots. And that's what we've been doing the past couple of videos. So first step, I subtract 26. So you're left with 2x squared equals -36. Divide by 2. So x squared is equal to -18. All right, now I'm going to take the square root. All right, so when I take the square root, I get x is equal to plus and minus the square root of -18. All right. Now you notice, all right, so don't worry about the negatives. That means this is no real solution, right? Because I have a negative here. So I'm going to have an imaginary solution, which means I'm going to end up having an I within my answer. So the first thing you do is, now once we solve, now we got to simplify the radical. So keep the plus and minus. We have -1 times 9 times 2. All right, I'm doing this the long way here, plus and minus. Well, in the previous slide, excuse me, right here, I is equal to the square root of negative 1. This is where we apply it. Here I have a square root. Let me rewrite this. So this is plus and minus square root of negative 1 times the square root of 9 times the square root of 2. So we're applying that property. So now I get plus and minus. That's I. Square root of 9 is 3. And radical 2 we can't simplify. So let's clean this up. So you plus and minus the number, then the variable, or I, then the radical. That's the proper order that you should put your answers in. All right, so really, it just helps, makes it look a little bit nicer. It gets rid of the negative inside the radical, even though it's still there. It's a form of mathematics. This is like proper grammar in mathematics. We don't leave it as a negative. In other words, if we don't have I, your answer will look like 3 square root of negative 2. That's not proper in mathematics. They like to rewrite it with the I. Right? And all this does, in general, all you need to know right now, there's no real solution. All right? That's all that really means. There's no real solution. It's an imaginary solution. We use I. All right? This is Barney's favorite math section. Is using your imagination, right? Let's look at another example. This one's nice. It's already, the x squared is already by itself, so we can just go ahead and take the square root. So x equals plus or minus the square root of negative 9. Well, that's plus or minus square root of negative 1 times the square root of 9. Well, that's plus or minus I, and the square root of 9, that's actually a perfect square, so that gives me 3. So we rewrite it as plus or minus 3i. You always put the I last, or in front, after the non-radical part and in front of a radical. Right? So that would be a solution, but it's not a real solution because you have I. In other words, you have a negative inside the radical. All right, so here, let's go ahead and subtract 3 from both sides. And my pen is dying. So let's have a moment of silence for the death of my pencil, or excuse me, my black pen. All right, thank you. Let's continue. All right, so we get 2x squared equals negative 10. Divide both sides by 2. You get x squared is equal to negative 5. All right, we isolated x squared. Now we take the square root of both sides. So x, since I took the square root, I put the plus and minus, square root of negative 5. So now I'll rewrite it, plus and minus square root of negative 1 times square root of 5. So that's plus and minus I. Radical 5, that does not simplify, so we just leave it. Right? And there's your non-real solution. The next one. All right, now you notice this is a little bit different. We have a quantity being squared now. All right, and we've done this in a previous video. So I got to get rid of the negative 1/2. So you multiply, by the reciprocal. So it's negative 2. Multiply by negative 2. So this gives me, that cancels, so you're left with x plus 1 quantity squared equals negative 10. You notice this right here, quantity that was in green, it's all by itself now. Now I can take the square root. Take the square root, I get x plus 1. All right, so since I cancel the square, that means the parentheses can drop or go away. Now here I have plus and minus because I took the square root of the square root of negative 10. All right, let's simplify this before we go any further. So this is the square root of negative 1 times the square root of 10. We know square root of negative 1 is I. Radical 10, that does not simplify, so we leave it as is. All right, now that's simplified. Now we go ahead and get x, isolate x by itself in our solve for x. So that means I got to subtract 1. Now I'm subtracting 1 And there's no way I can add or subtract to these because they're not like terms. You remember, as before, you take that value and put it in front of the plus and minus. Right? And there's my solutions. And just as before, this is one way you can write it, but if we pull it apart, remember there's two solutions here. There's -1 plus I radical 10. All right, whoever that is, please report to the main office. All right, and now pull it apart, so there's -1 minus I radical 10. So you can also write it that way. Just remember, there's two solutions, and they're these, but they're put into here. Now these are not real, these are considered two non-real, these are two non-real solutions, right? And we have one more, I think. Yes. Oh man, whoever come up with these examples, man, they're making it easy on us. See, that whole thing is being squared already by itself. So I can just go ahead and take the square root of both sides. Because those canceled. I took the square root, so I have both plus and minus, and I get radical -7. Right, I gotta simplify this first, so I keep this over here. Plus or minus square root of -1 times radical 7. So this becomes plus or minus I square root of 7. Square root of 7 cannot be simplified, so I'll leave it. Now, since this side is already simplified, now I can go ahead and add 1 to both sides. Now remember, this doesn't have an I or radical with it, so I put it in the front, and then the plus minus I radical 7. And there's your non-real solutions. And again, if I pull them apart, it will be these. Right? You have to recognize that both of these are the same thing. There's two solutions here because there's a plus and minus. But really, they look like this. Now, if you have any questions, please make sure you email me in my community or reply to this on the YouTube, and I'll create another video hoping to answer any questions that you have.